The transmission arrived at Fleet Command at 0317 hours, station time, and within 4 minutes every admiral on duty was awake. Within 12, the Secretary of Defense had been pulled from a state dinner on Kepler Station, her formal gown still on, her expression already hardening into the thing she wore when the news was categorically unsurvivable. Within 40, the Joint Chiefs were assembled in the deep briefing room beneath Command's central tower, the one with no windows and walls thick enough to contain what was said inside. The Moran transmission was 11 seconds long. It did not need to be longer. The alien who delivered it was Elder Verith, the same Elder Verith who had received humanity's surrender 3 years ago in this very system, who had accepted the treaty documents with hands that looked almost human except for the bone-reinforced knuckles and the fourth finger that bent backward at rest. He spoke in Moran, which the translation system rendered in flat, emotionless standard, which somehow made it worse. A vessel registered to the half-colonial authority crossed into Moran territorial space at coordinates 7-7 theta on the 14th day of this cycle. The crossing was without permission. Under the Compact of Recognized Conflict, the Moran nation invokes the right of champion resolution. Humanity has 72 hours to produce a recognized champion who will survive the greeting and contest the matter in designated combat. Failure to produce a champion constitutes automatic forfeiture. The contested resource is the Harith system and all human colonial infrastructure therein. We await your champion. Then silence. Then the screen went dark. Admiral Sarah Okafor was the first to speak, because she was always the first to speak, because someone had to be and she had accepted long ago that the weight of beginning fell on her. How did a colonial survey vessel get into Moran space, she said, and it was not a question. It was an accusation directed at no one in particular and everyone in the room simultaneously. Navigation error, said Deputy Chief Harlan. Automated drift during a charting run. The crew didn't even know they'd crossed the line until the Moran intercepted them. And the Moran let them go. The Moran let them go and then filed the challenge 6 hours later. They were already prepared. The room digested this. Outside, somewhere above the windowless walls, the Harith system existed, 8 million people on 3 habitable planets and 2 orbital stations, 3 generations of colonial effort, schools and hospitals and agricultural networks, and a cathedral someone had spent 40 years building from local stone. 8 million people who did not know that a navigation computer's drift error had just placed them at the center of an alien legal mechanism that humanity had agreed to and never once won. The greeting ritual, said Secretary Vasquez, setting down the glass of water she'd been handed. What are the parameters? General Ito pulled up the file. They all knew the file. They had all read the file 3 years ago when the Moran had first explained champion resolution to them, back when humanity's advisors had argued it was favorable, cleaner than fleet action, proportional, bounded. They had not fully processed the greeting ritual at the time because they had been focused on the combat itself, on whether human soldiers could fight Moran champions, on training regimens and weapon equivalencies and tactical analysis. The greeting ritual had seemed like a formality. It was not a formality. The Moran greeting between equals, between beings the Moran recognized as worthy of direct engagement, was a full-contact physical assessment. The challenger pressed their forehead to the champion's, and the champion's body responded instinctively, autonomically, with a pressure wave generated by the musculature in the skull and neck, a concussive bioresponse that the Moran had evolved as a dominant signal, now ritualized into ceremony. For Moran, it was mildly uncomfortable. For most humans, it caused immediate traumatic brain injury. Cardiac arrest followed within 30 seconds in the majority of cases. The Moran did not consider this violent. They considered it a threshold. If you could not survive being recognized, you could not be recognized. 3 years ago, humanity had sent 4 soldiers to attempt the greeting. 3 died. 1 survived long enough to begin the combat and was incapacitated in the first exchange. The forfeit had cost them the Aldenmere and Solis systems. There is no soldier in the human military who has successfully completed the greeting ritual, General Ito said, because he had to say it aloud, because the room needed to hear it stated plainly before they could move past it. There's one individual, said the intelligence officer in the back of the room. She had not been introduced. She rarely was. He's not in the military anymore. Okafor looked at her. Name: Staff Sergeant Kael. Formerly of the 9th Reconnaissance, Harith Colonial Defense Corps. She paused. The Harith system, specifically. The room went quiet in a different way. He's half Moran, the intelligence officer continued. His mother was a Moran exile, one of perhaps a dozen Moran who have ever voluntarily left their own civilization. His father was human, colonial-born. Kael grew up in the Harith system. He completed the greeting ritual 3 years ago as part of an unofficial test conducted without command approval. He survived. He was the only one who did. He was also discharged shortly afterward for reasons that are classified but relate to the incident at Champion Resolution 3 years ago. Where is he now? Vasquez asked. Kimura Station. Edge of surveyed space. He runs cargo. Or he drinks. The reports are somewhat contradictory. Okafor stood. 72 hours. Minus the 40 already spent in briefings and transmission delays. Minus travel time to the edge of surveyed space. Get me a shuttle, she said. Get me his full file on the way. And find out what happened 3 years ago. I need to know everything before I talk to him. She was in the air within the hour. Kimura Station smelled like recycled air and cheap protein synthesis and the particular kind of stale that accumulated in places where people had stopped expecting better. It was a waystation in the original sense, a place between other places, populated by people who were traveling and people who had stopped traveling and couldn't quite explain why. The docking rings were half full of mid-tier cargo haulers. The central corridor had 3 bars, a medical facility that doubled as a pawn shop, and a notice board where people posted jobs that paid in untraceable currency. Kael was in the second bar. Okafor had reviewed his file on the 4-hour transit. She had read it twice. She was a woman who had commanded fleet actions, who had sat across from Moran elders during the treaty negotiations and maintained composure while signing away 2 star systems, who had delivered death notifications to families on 6 separate occasions and never permitted herself to look away. She was prepared for most things. She was not entirely prepared for Kael. He was larger than the file suggested. The photos were all military era, taken when he was regulated, uniformed, reduced to standard documentation. In person, sitting at the end of a bar with a glass of something amber in front of him, he occupied space in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the Moran elders. Not aggressively, just completely, as though the space he inhabited had decided to belong to him and stopped arguing. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, human passing at a glance but not at a second look. The jaw was slightly too structured, the brow ridge a fraction too pronounced, the stillness with which he sat not quite achievable by human musculature in relaxed state. His eyes, when he looked up at her, were dark gold. Moran eyes. He had his father's face and his mother's eyes and the expression of someone who had made a private decision to feel as little as possible and had been largely successful. He looked at her uniform and looked away. "I'm not enlisting," he said. Okafor sat down across from him without being invited. Her aide, Commander Phelps, remained standing 2 steps back. "I'm not here to enlist you," she said. "Then whatever it is, no." He picked up his glass. "The Moran have invoked Champion Resolution. The Harith system." The glass stopped. It didn't make it to his mouth. It stopped in his hand, in the air, between the bar and his face, and for 3 full seconds he did not move at all. Then he set it down very carefully, the way a person sets something down when they are concentrating on keeping their hands steady. 72 hours, Okafor said. "We have had 72. We're now at 58. Travel time back to Fleet Command is 4 hours. The greeting ritual and formal challenge declaration takes approximately 6 more. That leaves us 48 hours to prepare a champion for the combat. Send someone else." "There is no one else. You know that. I know that 3 years ago you sent 4 soldiers through that greeting and 3 of them died and one of them almost made it. You can find another almost. Get one of those big Scandinavian special forces types. Get them a cranial brace. The Moran won't recognize a cranial brace. The greeting must be unassisted. Then you're forfeiting. 8 million people, Sergeant." The title landed wrong, and he looked at her directly for the first time. "Don't," he said quietly. 8 million people in the Harith system. I've been briefed on your service record. You were born in New Karis, on Harith Prime. Your father was a colonial agriculturalist. You went to school in the capital. You enlisted specifically to serve in colonial defense." She paused. "I know what happened 3 years ago. I know what you asked of command before the last champion resolution and what they told you, and I know what you did after. I'm not here to relitigate any of that. I'm here because there is no one else, and because 8 million people are going to lose everything unless you walk back into a room with a Moran elder. I lost, he said. You didn't compete. I was there. His voice was flat and final. I was in that room. I completed the greeting, and they wouldn't recognize me as a champion because I was half Moran, and they said that created a conflict of interest under the compact rules, and while Command was arguing the point, Hendricks went in. He stopped. You know what happened to Hendricks. He lost. He died 3 days later, officially from injuries sustained in a training exercise. Kael picked up his glass again. That's in his service record. Training exercise. He has a wife in the Aldenmere system, the system we forfeited, and his record says training exercise. He drank. So no. No thank you, Admiral. I've done my part. Okafor sat with that for a moment. She had known, reading the file, that this would be the wall she ran into. She had prepared for it. She had also prepared for what came next, and she did not look forward to it, because the intelligence officer had been right that it would change his answer, and she did not enjoy weaponizing grief. There is something you don't know, she said. There's a lot of things I don't know. I've been on this station for 8 months. It's about your mother. The quality of his stillness changed. It was still stillness, the same stillness, the Moran stillness, but it had a different weight behind it now. Like pressure behind glass. Your mother left the Moran civilization when she was very young. She built a life in the Harith system. She died when you were 11, in an accident at the agricultural collective where your father worked. Okafor kept her voice level. That is what you know. What you don't know, what Command sealed because they determined it was operationally irrelevant, is why she left. He said nothing. She was the daughter of Elder Verith. The glass went down again. She left because she disagreed with her father's interpretation of the compact. Specifically, his willingness to use champion resolution as a tool of territorial expansion rather than genuine conflict resolution. She thought it had been corrupted. She went into exile rather than support it. She settled in the Harith system specifically. Okafor let that land. The same system that is now the subject of a champion resolution challenge filed by Elder Verith himself. Who knows, Sergeant? He has always known who you are. He has known for 3 years. The challenge targeting Harith is not coincidental. Our analysts believe he is testing something. Kael stared at the bar surface. His jaw was working slightly, the way a person's jaw works when they are deciding something that has nothing to do with words. He wants to know, Okafor said softly, whether you're Moran enough to fight for something, or human enough to walk away from it. A long time passed. What are the rule changes? Kael said finally. From last time. Can they exclude me again on the conflict of interest grounds? We've had legal teams working the compact for 3 years. The exclusion clause requires that the conflict of interest be declared before the greeting, not after. If you complete the greeting and they recognize you, if they accept the ritual, they cannot subsequently challenge your standing. They'd have to accept you as humanity's champion. They'll make it harder. The greeting. Probably. He looked at his hands on the bar. The knuckles were scarred in the particular way that comes from hitting things that fight back. His right hand had a faint bone shadow beneath the skin over the second and third metacarpals that was not entirely human architecture. I need 12 hours of sleep, he said. I need access to a military training facility and a physician who is cleared to work on Moran physiology and won't ask me questions I don't want to answer. I need to know everything about the current Moran champion. Not the last one, the current one. I need the full compact rule set, and I need to read it myself, not a summary. He stood up. He was taller standing. And I need you to understand that I'm not doing this for command. I'm not doing this for the flag or the uniform or any of that. There are 8 million people in that system. My father's grave is on Harith Prime. I'm doing it for that. Only for that. Understood, Okafor said. And when it's over, win or lose, whatever is in my service record stays there. I don't want a ceremony. I don't want a reinstatement. I don't want anything from command afterward except to be left alone. Agreed. He walked toward the door, then stopped without turning around. How did she die? My mother. Specifically. Okafor was quiet for a moment. The report says a structural collapse at the collective's main storage facility. It was ruled accidental. And what does the sealed portion say? Another pause. There was a Moran observer in the system at the time. The observer left 6 hours before the collapse. The connection was never formally established. He stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Then he walked out. Okafor exhaled slowly, finished her own untouched water, and followed him. The military training facility at Kepler Station was stripped down to one room for Kael's use, mats, a sparring system, a medical bay adjoining. Dr. Priya Anand, who held dual certifications in human trauma surgery and xenobiology, met him at the door with his file in one hand and a scanner in the other, and the expression of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had decided to be professional about it regardless of what the scanner showed. It showed quite a bit. Your pain response is Moran attenuated, she said, reviewing the readout. You process pain signals at roughly 40% the rate of a baseline human. Your bone density is higher than human normal in the skull and upper cervical vertebrae. That's what allowed you to survive the greeting. Your skeletal musculature has Moran fast-twitch architecture in the upper body, human standard in the lower. You're a genuine hybrid, not a surgical modification. I know what I am, Kael said, not unkindly. I'm saying it because it matters for preparation. Your body will respond to physical stress the way a Moran responds, which means you can take more damage before registering functional impairment. But it also means you don't have the Moran's full regenerative capacity. You can absorb a Moran-level beating. You can't heal from it at Moran speed. She set the scanner down. Whoever you're fighting is going to be assuming you fight like a human. That's your only structural advantage. If you last long enough to prove otherwise, they may hesitate. Hesitation is recoverable. Underestimation is recoverable. But you need to last long enough. The intelligence brief on the Moran champion, Elder Veritha's chosen representative, was 12 pages and largely useless. They had a name, Saren. An age estimate, young by Moran standards, which meant physically prime, not yet slowed by the century-long arc of Moran aging. Combat designation, Varant class, the highest tier. 3 previous champion resolutions, 3 victories, none lasting more than 4 minutes. The longest of those 4 minutes had ended with a human soldier's sternum fracturing in 6 places. Kael read the file twice. Then he put it down and spent 6 hours doing something that looked from the outside like methodical violence against a training system calibrated to Moran physical parameters. It was not random. He was mapping, testing, finding the angles between human and Moran combat systems where something unexpected might live, where his hybrid body did something neither fully human nor fully Moran reflexes would anticipate. He found 3 things. He did not know if they would matter. He drilled them until his arms stopped feeling like arms and started feeling like problems he was managing. He slept 4 hours. He did not dream, or if he did, he did not remember it. In the remaining time, he sat with the compact. The compact of recognized conflict was 9,000 words of Moran legal doctrine translated into standard by a committee that had argued over every 3rd sentence. He read it slowly, the way he had been taught as a child to read things that mattered, not for information, but for what was left out. His mother had taught him that. She had also taught him that Moran law was not prescriptive. It was descriptive. It described the way things were, not the way they should be. The greeting ritual was not a test designed to kill humans. It was a test designed to recognize equals. The Moran had never imagined a non-Moran who could pass it, because no non-Moran ever had. Except him. He thought about Elder Verith, the man who had received his mother's exile request and granted it. Moran law required him to grant it, but he had granted it with something, some clause or condition, that wasn't in any of the files Okafor had shown him. He was certain of it. He was also certain that the challenge targeting Harith, his mother's system, his father's grave, was not an accident. Elder Verith was very old and very deliberate, and old deliberate people did not do things accidentally. He was testing something. Okafor had said it. He wanted to know if Kael was Moran enough to fight, or human enough to walk away. Kael turned the question over in the remaining hours and arrived, slowly, at the understanding that it was the wrong question. The right question was what Elder Verith would do with the answer, depending on what it was. He did not arrive at a satisfying conclusion. He went to fight anyway. The transit to the designated combat coordinates took 9 hours. He spent it in the ship's small cargo bay doing stretches designed to keep the specific musculature in his upper back and neck from seizing, which was a real risk given the greeting, which he had not had to survive in 3 years. Dr. Anand had given him a compound that supported Moran-attuned neural pathways during extreme physical stress. He took it 4 hours out and felt, for a while, more like himself than he usually did, which was not entirely comfortable. Commander Phelps attempted to brief him on diplomatic protocols 3 separate times. Kael was not available for any of them. He arrived in the chamber, a neutral space station, asteroid-hollowed, traditional Moran construction, smooth-walled and circular and lit from above by something that was neither exactly fluorescent nor natural, wearing no armor. The compact specified unarmored entry. He wore a close-fitted training suit, nothing military, nothing ceremonial. He had not allowed command to dress him in a uniform. He was not their soldier anymore. Elder Verith was already there. He was very old. This was the first thing you understood, looking at him, not in his face, which was relatively unlined by Moran standards, but in his presence, in the quality of attention he brought to the room. He was somewhere north of 200 years old. He had seen things that no living human had seen. He watched Kael enter with the gold eyes, the same gold eyes, Kael noted, with a sensation he declined to examine closely, and he said nothing. He inclined his head a fraction. Not greeting. Assessment. Saren stood to his right. The Moran champion was beautiful in the way dangerous things are beautiful, the way raptors are beautiful, the way fault lines are beautiful, the way anything is beautiful when it has been specifically designed by pressure and time to do one thing flawlessly. He was a head taller than Kael. His reach was longer. His bone structure, visible even through the ceremonial garb, was exactly what the Moran fast-twitch architecture looked like when it had never been diluted by a human genome. He watched Kael the way predators watch things, not hungrily. Patiently. "The greeting," Elder Verith said, in Moran. Kael answered in Moran. He had learned it from his mother in pieces, over 11 years, in the kitchen of a house on Harith Prime that no longer existed. "I am ready," he said. Something moved in Veritha's expression. Too fast to read. Saren stepped forward. The greeting was worse than he remembered. The last time, 3 years ago, he had been younger and more tensed, and it had hit him like a wall. This time he knew it was coming, which meant his body had the 3 seconds before impact to both prepare and dread, which was almost worse. Saren's forehead met his with precision, not a crash, a press, deliberate and direct, the concussive bio-wave radiating outward from the Moran skull musculature in a pulse that Kael's body received in the reinforced architecture of his brow and upper cervical spine and transmitted downward. The room went white. Not dark, white. His vision blanked completely for 2 seconds while his brain processed the impact load and sorted itself out, the Moran-attuned neural pathways handling what the human standard ones would not have survived. He felt his legs want to buckle, and he told them no with the part of his brain that had learned, over many years of doing hard things, to speak to his body in a register just below thought. The legs did not buckle. His vision returned. He was still standing. Saren stepped back and looked at him. There was a long moment. Elder Verith had said nothing from his position at the chamber's edge. The 2 Moran delegates flanking him were motionless. Then Saren inclined his head, a full inclination, chin to chest, the Moran gesture of recognized equals, and said, in Moran, "You are recognized." Whatever argument Command's legal team had prepared in case of rejection was not needed. Kael filed this away and turned his attention entirely to the being across from him who was about to try to remove him from consciousness by whatever means the compact permitted. The compact permitted quite a lot. No weapons. Everything else was interpretation. Saren moved first. It was not what Kael had expected from a variant-class champion, not a testing feint, not a circling assessment. It was immediate and full force, and it told him something useful. Saren had not fought a being like Kael before. He was opening with a sequence that had worked against every human champion he'd faced, which was a shoulder drive into a locked grip designed to use Moran leverage and weight advantage to control the human center of gravity and put them on the ground, where Moran fighting systems were overwhelming. Against a baseline human, it worked in under 4 seconds. Kael was not baseline. He took the shoulder drive and let it arrive, gave it a half-second more than a human would have, which meant Saren was already past the point of adjustment when Kael's response came. He used his lower body, which was human architecture and therefore moved in a way Saren's pattern recognition wasn't calibrated for, to redirect his weight down and left instead of resisting. The locked grip became a leveraged rotation. Saren was large, but he was not expecting this, and for one fraction of a second he was off-axis. Kael hit him in the floating ribs with an elbow. Even on a Moran, that mattered. Not a knockout. Not a break. A notification: I can reach you, I know where the soft points are, adjust your model of what I am. Saren adjusted instantly, which was terrifying and also useful because it meant he was paying full attention now, and a Moran paying full attention was a Moran who had stopped relying on pattern library and started actually looking. They reset. The next 4 minutes were the worst of Kael's life, which was a category with significant competition. Saren was not a system. He was not a sequence of memorized responses. He was a highly intelligent organism with 2 centuries of trained combat heritage running in his nervous system, and once he stopped treating Kael like a human soldier and started treating him like an unknown variable, he became categorically more dangerous. He stopped committing to locks and grips. He started using the Moran version of what humans would call probing, fast, partial force strikes designed to find where Kael's response patterns broke down, where the hybrid architecture made inconsistent decisions, where the seam between human lower body and Moran upper body created exploitable transition moments. He found one. It was in the shoulder rotation during a lateral move. Kael's Moran upper body musculature wanted to commit to the rotation, and his human lower body couldn't fully support it, and for a half beat he was generating force in a direction he couldn't brace against. Saren found it on the 3rd exchange, and on the 4th, he did not probe it, he struck it. The blow landed on Kael's left shoulder, rear quarter, and it was not a punch. It was a Moran structural strike, which is less about mass and more about frequency, a rapid sequence impact targeting the joint's rotator architecture. Kael felt his left arm go partially numb from the shoulder to the elbow. Not broken. Functionally compromised. He had been in combat for less than 5 minutes, and already his primary limb was at 60%. He had expected this. He had not expected it so fast. Okay, he thought. Different problem now. A compromised left arm meant he was asymmetrical, which humans tried to compensate for and Moran tried to exploit. He did neither. He let the asymmetry exist. He stopped hiding it, which surprised Saren. Saren had struck the shoulder expecting a human to retreat and guard the damage. Kael stepped forward instead, inside the reach advantage, and went low. His lower body was fully human. Saren did not have a well-developed model for human lower body combat systems. This was Kael's 3rd exploit, the one he'd drilled in the training room, a takedown attempt from inside Moran reach that gave up the leverage battle entirely in exchange for a wrestling frame that Moran fighting systems did not prioritize because Moran fighting systems assumed gravity would be resolved in the Moran's favor. He got Saren down. Not controlled. Not mounted. Just down, one knee on the floor, the other braced, and it cost Kael his right arm as Saren used the descent to drive an elbow backward into his forearm with enough force that something in the forearm made a decision Kael would prefer it hadn't. Not a full break. A fracture. A partial fracture in the radius, the bone announcing itself as newly and structurally relevant. He did not let go. He could not get Saren down fully. The mass differential was too significant, and Saren's Moran architecture meant his ground recovery was faster than any human's. But down was not the goal. The goal was the position. The position allowed Kael's left arm, the compromised one, the arm Saren thought was neutralized, to come across from the inside. He had spent 6 hours drilling this. The Moran neck has a nerve cluster at the rear junction of skull and spine that does not exist in human anatomy. Kael had learned about it from his mother at age 9, in a conversation that had been about something else entirely. She'd been explaining why she'd left, not the politics, the personal, and she'd said something about the greeting, about why it was designed the way it was, about what exactly it was testing. And in explaining it, she'd told him where the vulnerability was. The one place on a Moran body that was not reinforced. The one place that had never needed to be reinforced, because no non-Moran had ever been in a position to reach it. His left hand, partially numb, compromised at 60%, found that cluster. He pressed. He pressed with specific, directional, localized force, the way Dr. Anand had shown him in the training bay using a holographic Moran anatomy model. Saren went rigid. Not unconscious. Not down. Rigid, the involuntary motor lock that the cluster governed in Moran physiology, the system that hadn't needed protecting because no one had ever reached it. It lasted, maybe, 2 seconds. 2 seconds of complete involuntary stillness. Kael used one of them. He could not knock Saren unconscious from this position. He did not have the mass or the leverage or the arm functionality. What he had was one arm, 1 second, and the forearm fracture that made his right arm a lever he was going to regret using. He drove his right forearm against the rear of Saren's skull, the forehead bone, the only reinforced zone, from behind, with everything remaining in his upper body, using the Moran musculature that his mother had given him and that he had never asked for and had spent 34 years making peace with. The sound was significant. Saren went forward. Not all the way. His arms caught him. His knees were already on the floor, and his arms caught him, and for a moment he was on all fours, and then he gathered himself. Kael could see him gathering himself, the deliberate collection of Moran will against involuntary physical response, and began to push upward. Kael had one arm. The other was fractured. His left arm was returning sensation in the form of sharp electrical unhelpfulness. He had been in the combat for, he had lost track. Long enough. He was bleeding from somewhere above his left eye from an exchange he could not specifically recall, and his neck hurt in the way his neck had hurt 3 years ago after the first greeting, and his legs were still working but had opinions about how long that would continue. He let Saren start to rise. He let him get to one knee. Then he hit him again in the same spot, not the cluster this time. The cluster was a one-use tool, Saren's motor system would have adapted, but in the brow bone, the reinforced brow bone, which could absorb a significant amount of impact. He hit it with the heel of his left hand, putting everything remaining in his shoulder and upper body behind it, and he felt the impact travel all the way up his compromised arm and light every damaged nerve like a fire alarm. It didn't matter. What mattered was Saren. Saren's head snapped back. His one-braced knee gave way. His arms, which had been pushing him upward, lost the argument with gravity. He went down to the floor, fully, both shoulders on his back, and his eyes were open and they were tracking and he was conscious and he was trying to rise, visibly trying, but the rise was not happening. Not yet. Not immediately. In Moran champion resolution, the contest ends when one champion cannot rise within a count of 10, administered by the presiding elder. Elder Verith began to count. In Moran. Kael heard the count from somewhere very far away. He was on one knee. He did not know exactly when that had happened, when he had transitioned from standing to kneeling, but he was on one knee with his fractured arm held against his side and his left hand on the floor in front of him and his head down, watching the mat, which was doing something slightly strange at the edges of his vision. Saren was trying to rise. He watched it happen. He watched the Moran champion's extraordinary body try to do what it had always done, what it had done 3 times before, what it had been trained and built and designed over a lifetime to do. He watched Saren get his arms under him, get his chest off the floor, get his shoulders up. He watched him get one knee, and then lose the other arm, and go back to 3 points, and hold there, and try again. Elder Verith counted. On 8, Saren's knee came off the floor. On 9, he was at 2 knees. On 10, he was at 1 knee and both hands, and his head was up, and his eyes found Kael, and what was in his eyes was not defeat, not exactly. It was recognition. The same recognition from the greeting. You are what you are. But he was not standing. Elder Verith said the 10th count, and then he stopped counting, and the chamber was silent. Saren lowered his head. Kael did not move for a long time. His right arm was telling him a very specific and urgent story about radial fractures, and he was not in a position to do anything about it. His knee was on the floor, and his hand was on the floor, and his head was trying to drift toward the mat, and he was preventing it through an act of will that was costing him everything left in the reserve. He was still upright. He was on one knee, one hand, partially vertical, bleeding, broken, his vision narrowed to a tunnel with a Moran champion at the end of it who was, barely, lower than he was. He was still upright. He heard Elder Verith breathing across the chamber. He heard his own pulse, which had opinions. He heard the chamber's overhead lights doing something with a frequency that made the inside of his skull resonate slightly, which was a new development he chose not to think about. He stayed upright. The Moran delegation was silent for a long time. This was not, Kael would later understand, the silence of deliberation. It was not the silence of people deciding what to do. It was the silence of people who had watched something and needed a moment before words were possible again. It was the silence you maintained in the presence of something that had required something of you, even if you were only a witness, even if it was only the act of witnessing that had been required. Elder Verith stood at the chamber's edge with his hands folded and his gold eyes on Kael, and he said nothing for 40 seconds by Kael's internal count, which was running slow and might have been a minute. Saren had lowered himself fully to the floor, not collapsed, deliberately lowered, the Moran way of acknowledging completion, and lay still with the precision of someone conserving recovery resources. The two flanking delegates were motionless. Commander Phelps, who had been permitted to observe from a sealed secondary chamber, would later report that the silence felt like weather. Like the moment before a storm makes up its mind. Dr. Anand was in the secondary chamber. She wanted very badly to come through the door. She was not coming through the door because she understood, precisely, that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was interrupt whatever was happening in this room. Kael stayed on one knee. He had decided, at some point during the silence, that he was not going to get up. Not yet. Not to prove something, not to perform recovery for the delegation's benefit. He was on one knee because he was on one knee, and there was no deception in that, and he had no energy left for deception in any case. His arm was fractured, and his shoulder was compromised, and something in his neck had opinions, and he was on one knee, with his remaining hand flat on the floor and his head up, looking at the space between him and the Moran delegation. He looked at his hands. His right hand was slightly swollen already, the radius announcing itself through the skin. His left hand was returning full sensation in the form of a comprehensive critique of everything that had happened to it. They were his father's hands in the skin, in the shape of the knuckles. His father had worked the land, had big blunt working hands that knew how to hold things, how to fix things, how to build the kind of things that lasted. His mother's hands had been narrower, the bones closer to the surface, the joints more pronounced. He had his father's hands with his mother's bones underneath them. His whole life was like that, actually. He was still looking at his hands when Elder Verith spoke. The Moran elder walked, not quickly, not slowly, with the careful deliberate pace of someone who had been walking carefully and deliberately for 2 centuries and had stopped thinking about it, to the center of the chamber. He stood 10 feet from Kael. He looked at him for another long moment. Then he spoke, in perfect standard, with no translation delay and no accent except the faint rounding of certain consonants that Kael recognized from childhood, from a kitchen, from a voice reading to him in 2 languages on alternate nights. He is Moran enough. The words landed in the chamber and did not echo. They did not need to echo. They occupied the space completely. Kael looked up. Elder Veritha's face was not expressionless. It was complicated, which was not the same thing, and which Kael would think about later, in the weeks that followed, trying to read what had been there. There was something that might have been grief, in the Moran configuration of grief, which looked less like sorrow and more like extreme precision. There was something that might have been recognition, the same recognition Saren had given him in those last seconds. You are what you are, but from a different direction. From the direction of someone who had known, for a long time, that this moment was possible. Who had perhaps arranged things, over 3 years and across star systems, to make this moment arrive. His mother's father. Kael looked at him for a moment. He did not know what his face was doing. He suspected it was not doing very much, because he had run out of capacity for whatever his face normally managed. Then he looked back at his hands. They were still his father's hands with his mother's bones. They were still fractured and compromised and covered in the kind of minor carnage that comes from a combat that has been conducted very seriously. They were the hands of a cargo hauler from Kimura Station who had left a glass of something amber on a bar and gotten on a shuttle and come here, for 8 million people, for his father's grave, for nothing more complicated than that. Elder Verith spoke again, still in standard, but lower, directed not at the room but at Kael specifically. She would have wanted to see this, he said. She would have argued that it proved her point. She was always arguing with me about what Moran enough meant. A pause. She usually won. Kael said nothing. He was looking at his hands. He was also, very carefully, not looking at the specific geometry of Elder Veritha's eyes, which were the same color as his own and which he had been not looking at for the past 6 minutes with enormous effort. Commander Phelps came through the door. Dr. Anand was right behind her, Moving fast. Scanner already active. Phelps had a face full of things she wanted to say and the professionalism to know this was not the moment for any of them. Anand went to Kael's side and ran the scanner over his arm and made a sound that was professionally neutral and personally alarmed. "I need to get you to medical," she said quietly. "In a minute," Kael said. She read his face and waited. He was still on one knee. The Harith system was still there. 8 million people had just continued existing, and they did not know it yet, and they would not know it for some time, and when they found out they would be told something that was the truth but not all the truth, that a champion had competed and won, and the compact had been satisfied, and the system was secure. Some of them would celebrate. Some of them would simply exhale, the way people exhale when a very bad thing did not happen. His father, if he had been alive, would have exhaled and then gone back to the fields and not spoken of it again for a long time, and then brought it up unexpectedly one evening in a way that made clear he had been thinking about it all along. He thought about his father. He thought about his mother, not the memory of her face, which had gotten harder to access over the years, but the specific memory of her voice reading to him in 2 languages, Moran and Standard, alternating paragraphs, because she had said it was important to hold both, to not let either one win. He had thought for many years that she meant linguistically. He was rethinking this now. Elder Vareth was still there. He had not moved. He was not going to move, Kael realized. Not until Kael stood up, because the Moran did not leave an elder's presence before the elder departed, and the Moran elder was not going to depart before Kael stood up, and this was either protocol or something else, and Kael thought it was something else. "Get up," some part of him said. "Not for them. Just get up." The fracture in his arm offered a detailed counterargument. He listened to it and ignored it, which was a skill he had developed over a long life of his body having opinions he could not afford. He moved his left hand from the floor. He shifted his weight over his one standing knee. He found his feet, both of them, in the way that feet occasionally need to be found after a significant physical event, with specific attention and some negotiation. His right arm was a problem he held against his side and did not involve in the process. He stood up. Slowly. Not heroically. There was nothing heroic about the specific mechanical process of getting vertical when 2/3 of your upper body had been recently restructured by a Moran champion's full professional attention. It was just standing. It was just the decision to be standing rather than kneeling, converted by stages into physical reality. But he was standing. Dr. Anand put a hand under his left arm to support him, and he let her, because he had enough clarity remaining to understand that independence and stupidity were not the same thing, and that winning a champion resolution combat and then falling over in front of the Moran delegation would constitute a tonal problem. Elder Vareth watched him stand. When Kael was fully vertical, not gracefully, not cleanly, but upright, the elder inclined his head. Not the fractional assessment from the beginning. The full inclination. Chin to chest. Kael did not incline his head back. He looked at the elder. He looked at his mother's father, who was very old and very deliberate and who had been testing something, and who had gotten his answer, and who was now standing in a chamber on the edge of human space looking at the being who had just determined the fate of 8 million people and who had his daughter's eyes. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and let Anand steer him toward the door, and he did not look back. Phelps fell into step beside him and opened her mouth, and he said, without looking at her, "Not now." She closed her mouth. The corridor was longer than he remembered. The ship was at the end of it. The medical bay was on the ship. His arm was telling him urgent things that he was scheduling for later, along with several other categories of urgent thing that he was not ready to process in a ship's corridor on the edge of surveyed space while still bleeding slightly above his left eye. He stopped walking. Just for a second. Just to breathe. Anand waited. Phelps waited. The corridor waited. He thought about Kimura Station and the glass of something amber that was still on the bar, probably, because he had not finished it. He thought about 8 million people who did not know what day it had been for them. He thought about his father's grave on Harith Prime, under the kind of sky that only existed there, a particular shade of late-afternoon blue-green from the atmospheric composition, a color that existed nowhere else in human space, that his father had pointed at once and said that's why we stayed. He thought about his mother's voice in 2 languages. He thought about what it meant to hold both, to not let either one win. He looked at his hands again. Then he started walking. The medical bay was prepared. Anand's team worked on his arm without speaking except clinically, which was exactly right. The fracture was clean, a single radial crack that would take 6 weeks fully managed, for weeks if he pushed it, which he told him he would not be doing. He did not argue. He was sitting on a medical table with an arm that had been set and sealed and was now expressing its feelings through a bone conduction ache, and outside the ship's viewport the stars were present and indifferent and not doing anything except being where they'd always been. Phelps knocked on the med bay door 4 hours out, and he let her in. "The secretary wants to speak with you," she said. "Tell her when we land. The Moran delegation has formally certified the result. The challenge is resolved. The Harith system." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said, "I know you said you didn't want anything afterward. I know what you asked for. But there are 8 million people who are going to want to know who did this for them." "They don't need to know," Kael said. "They'll find out anyway. These things. They'll find out or they won't. I don't need them to." He looked out the viewport. "I did it for my father's grave. I did it for the color of the sky in the afternoons. That's enough. The rest of them can go about their day." Phelps sat down across from him. She had the look of someone choosing their next words carefully, which he respected. "The elder," she said finally. "Vareth. He said something to you. At the end. Something specific. I couldn't hear from the secondary chamber, but it wasn't protocol. Do you want to tell me what it was?" Kael looked at his hands. He had his father's hands with his mother's bones. He was on a ship heading back toward the interior, toward command, toward whatever debriefings and documentation and formal protocols attended a champion resolution victory. He was going to land and sign things and answer questions, and then he was going to get back on a shuttle and go somewhere and be left alone, which was what he had asked for and intended to collect. He thought about what Vareth had said. She would have wanted to see this. She would have argued that it proved her point. He thought about what it meant to prove a point. His mother had left a civilization rather than participate in something she believed was wrong. She had lived a quiet life on a colony world and raised a son in 2 languages and died in a facility collapse that may not have been an accident, and the point she had been making with her life, with her exile, with her choices, with the son she raised to hold both and not let either one win, was that the categories were wrong. That the question of whether you were Moran enough or human enough was the wrong question. That enough was not a measure of degree but of decision. That what you were enough of was determined not by your genome but by what you showed up for. He thought the elder had perhaps known this for a long time. He thought the elder had perhaps needed to see it demonstrated. He thought 200 years of deliberateness was a long time to be testing a question. He did not know if he was going to do anything with this understanding. He did not know if there was anything to do with it. The compact existed, and the Moran existed, and humanity was still smaller and weaker and slower in most of the ways that mattered in the long diplomatic game of species-level survival, and one champion's victory in one chamber did not change the architecture of any of that. But 8 million people were waking up tomorrow on 3 habitable planets and 2 orbital stations, and they were going to look up at the Harith sky, that specific blue-green, that color that only existed there, and it was going to be their sky, still. His father's grave was under that sky. That was enough. "No," he said to Phelps. "I don't want to tell you." She nodded and didn't push, and he was grateful for it. Outside the viewport, the stars continued. He looked at them for a while, and then he closed his eyes, and for the first time in 36 hours he let himself be somewhere other than a chamber with a Moran champion and a clock that was running down. He let himself be on a ship, moving through space, with a repaired arm and a body that had opinions and a question he had been asked by the color of someone's eyes that he was not yet ready to answer. He would go back to Kimura Station. He would sleep. He would figure out the rest later. He was still upright. That was, for now, enough.